On this episode of Most Notorious, quack doctor and Jack the Ripper suspect, Francis Tumblety.
So it was the uterus from 2 women, the kidney from 1, and then the heart from Mary Kelly. How coincidental that in January of 1888, and when Tumblety was in Toronto, he told his Toronto reporter that he was constantly in dread of sudden death because of kidney and heart disease. And here's a guy who has a history of this uterus collection. So those organs can only be connected to one suspect when you look at all the suspects. Nobody else knows why did Jack the Ripper steal those organs.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. Thank you for joining me. Just a quick reminder, my new Aghast at the Past 1892 podcast begins on January 1st. I released a trailer a few days ago, and if you haven't heard it yet, give it a listen. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. All right, on to the interview. I am so pleased to introduce my guest, author and lecturer Michael L. Hawley. He is a retired commander and naval aviator in the U.S. Navy and currently a co-host on NBC Radio's House of Mystery. He is the author of 7 books as well, and the one he is here to talk about today is called Jack the Ripper, Suspect, Dr. Francis Tumblety. Thank you for joining me today. Great to have you.
Oh, my pleasure.
So the Jack the Ripper murders are very iconic. And there are so many suspects. And there are a lot of fans of the case, armchair detectives, who feel very strongly about one suspect or another. It's got to be difficult wading into this famous case, especially with a book. Lots of praise, but lots of criticism, too, from people who have such firm opinions about who they think Jack the Ripper really was.
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure. And then one of the things that I did was I went basically the appropriate way. My background is the physical sciences, and I've done peer review. And peer review is you go right to the experts. And then so what I did is my research articles are based on data, stuff I found. And so then I would send it off to one of our journals that we write to is a ripperologist. So I've written over a dozen of those, and my books are basically a compilation of those articles because they all fit. My first book, The Ripper's Haunts, or the nonfiction that was based on Francis Tumblety, that came out in 2016, one of the expert of experts, a Paul Begg, who's been researching this for decades, for over 40 years. He is the book reviewer of all Jack the Ripper books. And he's really critical because he wants to make sure that, it's a credible book. And so what he had said about mine was that it was the best book of 2016, and for that matter, 2015. And now we had to take Tumblety seriously. And why that was important is because even though Francis Tumblety was rediscovered in the early 1990s by Stuart Evans, when I got involved in 2009, the experts tended to think Tumblety was not considered a serious suspect at all. Even Scotland Yard did not consider him a suspect. Well, the discoveries I found were the reverse of that. And the man that had discovered him, Stuart Evans, demonstrated that he was actually correct, that Tumblety was not only a serious suspect, he was probably the serious suspect at the peak of the murders. So I exploited the experts. And so what happens is I find value in it because it's all based on the experts ripping me apart. So, it's kind of ironic that the term ripping apart, but that's the only way that you can judge or assess your book. And it's kind of tougher because many researchers are generalists, where they research the Jack the Ripper murders because there's so much to it, but they're not specialists as in suspect ripperologists. And I'm a suspect ripperologist, So people tend to automatically assume that you're biased. So that's why I have to go right to the experts and let them look at my research with a fine-tuned comb, so that any kind of mistakes, they're going to bring it out. So
Tumblety is actually considered the American suspect, right?
yes. There's a couple suspects that are, from America, but Tumblety actually he considered himself a British subject because he was born in Ireland in 1830. And then during the potato famine, that's when he came across 1847 with his family. Although there's some family members already here, I found the father and the family in Ireland, and they were on a poor tenant farm in County Meath. So when Tumblety started going back and forth to England after he was basically a millionaire in today's standards, by around 1869, and then every year he would go to England up until the murders. He was an American. It depends on who he was talking to. He'd say he was an American or he was a British subject.
So Tumblety was a doctor by period standards anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there were different kinds of doctors back then. How's that? So the established medical community was in its infancy. And the medical community, with going to med school, they opted for allopathic medicine, which is chemistry. But during the mid-1800s and the early 1800s, they were still bloodletting, and they were still using poisonous substances. But at the same time, there was homeopathic medicine around. There was herbalistic medicines, different kinds, Thomsonian herbalistic medicine. And what Tumblety did was the Indian herb doctor. He was an herbalist. So at that time, Tumblety, they were dirt poor. But the nice thing about the Northeast at the time, especially New York, thanks to the Erie Canal, they moved to Rochester, New York, where business was really prospering. And so what he did is he hooked up initially as an office boy for this French cures doctor. His French name was Lispinard, but his name was Reynolds. The French were considered better at sex diseases, a more promiscuous kind of culture. So that's what Tumblety was doing initially. He was spreading out pamphlets. And so some of the Christian community thought that was pornographic material. That was 1850. But 1853, there was this charismatic Indian herb doctor, R.J. Lyons, that came into Rochester. And Tumblety hooked onto him real fast. This man was just a few years, maybe 10 years older than Tumblety. But by 1856, Tumblety was already a fully fledged Indian herb doctor, crossed the border into London, Ontario, and opened up his first office. Within that year, he was a millionaire in today's standards. So he knew the business and he knew how to profit. And it was all about exploitation. It was a quack business. And so even though the herbal medicines made you feel good, Tumblety claimed he was curing people. He was curing cancer. He was curing consumption or TB. He was curing everything, yet he really wasn't. He would just make them feel well, and he was really exploiting even the wealthy. And so he was very good at that. But eventually they caught on to him, so he'd have to kind of move his business to another city and then go back and forth. And that was the mid-1800s when cable communication wasn't really big yet. So when he would go to another city, they didn't really know about him yet. But eventually it caught up with him. But still, he was what they called the Prince of Quacks. He was the man that he really made money. He would go into a city. First, he would just flood the newspapers with multi-column articles about him and his expertise. Lots of testimonials from the previous city, from mayors, from doctors, how great he was. And then he would go in and he would wear 5 suits a day, and he would have dogs with him. He would enter circus style, get all of attention. And how ironic, one time around 1856 near Buffalo, he was opening up an office, and what he would do is he would go into the post office. He would mail himself a letter, and when he would go in there, he would start opening up the letter, and he would use this letter opener, and what happened was there'd be coins and dollar bills that would accidentally fall on the floor, and he would leave it for the kids. And then so just kind of walk out like he was just this wealthy person. But while he was opening one of the letters, he says, "I call this gutting." So,
Oh,
how ironic, and 30 years later, he is a suspect for Jack the Ripper who gutted his victims.
yeah. Can we talk about his physical appearance, the way he dressed?
So his business model was to gain attention, limelight. But that was not during the Ripper murders, not during the 1880s, but that in the early days, he would go in, he would try to gain attention. He would, like in Buffalo, New York, what he would do is he would dress extravagantly, and then he would give away barrels of flour for everybody. But he wouldn't publicize it all the time. He'd always report that in the paper so everybody saw that. In the meantime, he was raking in the dough. So that's kind of how he got his attention. But interestingly, the very first office he opened up in London, Ontario, is the very first record of we see him giving poor treatment to some of the ladies, some of the women. So his misogyny started coming out right at the onset.
What did he look like?
A lot of misconceptions about that as well. We do have now photograph of him, but he was 6 foot tall, and some people claimed he was 6'4", things of that nature. But no, in his autobiographies, he wrote 6 autobiographies. He was quite the narcissist. But what happened is he wrote that he was 6 foot tall, and he was proud of his height, that he was taller. So if he was really 6'2", he would have definitely claimed that he was 6'2". But at the time, Buffalo Bill was a popular character. So a lot of the Indian herb doctors would try to emulate that with long hair, flowing mustache, and that's what Tumblety would do, anything for attention. But in the meantime, as early as 1860, I have record of him in the evening sneaking into the slums. And so then he would dress down when he would sneak into the slums. And then because he had a habit of picking up young men and even molesting them. So he would also hire young men too as office boys. And then eventually he would molest them. And then he would wind up in jail. Sometimes what would happen when he would dress down, he would go into the slums of every city. And when he would get arrested for some reason, he had gold and diamonds in one pocket. He had upwards of thousands of dollars of today's value in the other pocket, never mixed the cash and the jewelry. And so why he did that was when he would be arrested, he would show the police his pockets and explain that I'm actually just slumming it because I am a person of great wealth, so I should be treated accordingly. So that's kind of one of the reasons. But also it allowed him to post bail quickly. So, and then he could hire the best attorneys, and then he got out of quite a few cases, but eventually caught up with him.
And you write in your book that he had a connection to John Wilkes Booth as well.
Yes, and it's kind of a curious thing because when he was actually arrested on suspicion of the Lincoln assassination, and it was because what happened is Tumblety's, when he was in Brooklyn the year before in 1864, he had an office boy that he would use, and what I reported, and I wrote an article on this, when John Wilkes Booth went to New York City to perform in 1864 with his brothers. That was the last time he performed with his brothers. His mother lived in New York City, and Tumblety he had a passion for plays and performances. And what happened was that office boy said that Tumblety and John Wilkes Booth knew each other, but more importantly, that the other conspirator or the assassin, David Harold, Tumblety actually had hired Harold in 1864 as an office boy, which I demonstrate that that's wrong because it was actually another person, Mark Blackburn, that was who it was. But they looked alike. But the important thing is Tumblety, because that was a case of mistaken identity, he could also say that he was never a friend of John Wilkes Booth. Well, what do we find? Record of him, John Wilkes Booth was in 1863, the year before that, he was performing in Buffalo, and he was hanging out with Francis Tumblety. So I have record of Tumblety being in that area, and so the eyewitness was likely correct that he was hanging out with Tumblety. And the only reason why he would have been hanging out with John Wilkes Booth is because he loved young men, and he loved actors. Had nothing to do with anything about being pro-Southern, pro-Union, anything, because Tumblety only cared about himself. So any kind of cause, even the Irish Fenian cause, that would be kind of a side thing that Tumblety would exploit. But it was all about himself, really.
So you're saying that his association with Booth was partly the result of an attraction, a crush? Or?
Yeah, and he likely probably would have liked to have a relationship with him, but John Wilkes Booth, that now of course actors, they can, who knows, but John Wilkes Booth had a fiancée at the time, I think. But it would have been an issue where John Wilkes Booth was looking for money. He wanted funding for what he was doing, and he would have loved this Irish American here that had a lot of money, so he could take advantage of him and maybe try to convince him to join the cause. And that's where I would see that Tumblety would never have done that.
And you said he was arrested, right?
Yeah, he was arrested for 3 weeks. What happened was he was in St. Louis, and he was initially arrested because he was wearing semi-military uniform. But then Tumblety actually went to Lincoln's funeral. At the end of the funeral, it was in Springfield, Illinois. Edwin Stanton was the Secretary of War at the time, and he was a radical Republican. Stanton actually was the one that got Tumblety arrested, because when they got word of this young boy thinking that Tumblety was connected to him, they just immediately arrested him. The writ of habeas corpus was around at the time. That means that if you get arrested, then within 24 hours, you have to be in front of the judicial system, with the exception of the Civil War. If it had anything to do with the Civil War, Lincoln assassination, they could hold you for 3 weeks. Tumblety hated that, and so he wrote about that. His first autobiography was all about his wrongful arrest, which it likely was a wrongful arrest, but they kept him in there for 3 weeks at the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. But eventually they had to let him go because they would have not had anything on him. But yeah, that happened. So a lot of people thought, well, here's Tumblety trying to get into the limelight, so that's why he did it. But it was really not. It was Tumblety would not have enjoyed that, because he actually liked the Lincolns. He claimed that he was friends with the Lincolns. Back then, the president-elect, it was not January 20th that you become president. It was in March. So what Lincoln did was he would go into for his inaugural address, and he had a parade that went through New York City. And wouldn't you know, there were reports of Tumblety on his horse next to the Lincoln's buggy. So he was right with them. And the report was that Tumblety actually took care of his son at some watering hole, maybe Saratoga Springs or something, the year before. So he likely did have a kind of a distant friendship or something, especially with the wife, I'm sorry. So Tumblety did not hate Lincoln's. He was not pro-Southern, but he hated Stanton. Because Stanton was, what happened is when Lincoln was assassinated, Stanton, the Secretary of War, took over. It wasn't the vice president at the time was quite junior and insecure. So Stanton, because he was in charge of the army, he basically started ordering everybody around. And so Stanton controlled it with an iron fist until the vice president could become president. So in there, that's when Tumblety got arrested. So Tumblety just blamed everything on this radical Republican. So that's kind of what he writes in his autobiography.
When we come back, possible reasons for Dr. Tumblety's intense hatred of women. Back again. So not only was he a peddler of remedies, cure-all remedies, but he also considered himself a surgeon as well.
Yes, exactly. And especially he in his autobiographies, he writes that he is a disciple of Abernathy. Abernathy was a surgeon in the early 1800s in England who pushed not to have surgery. Remember, back then, it was pre-antibiotics. So after surgery, lots of people died anyway. So it was a 50-50 shot just because of, infection. So Abernathy promoted taking care of it with drugs. And then so at the time, though, the medical community, as I said before, that it was about allopathic medicine, not herbal medicine. Yeah, so Tumblety, when he started the business, when he was going through Toronto, he just cared about being an Indian herb doctor because he was really making a lot of money. But what happened was when he got into Toronto, he actually was charged twice for selling without a license. And in Canada at the time, you had to, have passed, the board has to accept you. The medical board was controlled by the medical community that promoted allopathic medicine. So if you weren't, you're screwed. So you wouldn't get the license. And so he did not have an MD. He never went to medical school. Well, so what happened is that he got out of that actually, but then when he went to Montreal, he got in trouble there, and the medical community actually tried to set him up with an abortion case, but he got away with that. So eventually, he went to St. John, where he was arrested for using the title of MD. So because of this experience in Canada, that he needed this medical diploma, he faked one from Philadelphia. So he faked that he had a medical diploma, but they caught on to him. He knew that the surgeons at the time, that not only would you have a medical diploma, but to be a credible surgeon, that you would give these illustrated lectures. You'd invite people. And illustrated means that you illustrate it with the anatomical specimens. So what happened is when at the onset of the Civil War, when General McClellan was actually the general of the Potomac, right after the Battle of the Bull Run in July 1861, that the North was trying to stand up an army. And so a lot of Northerners were coming to Washington, D.C. at the time. Here comes Francis Tumblety. And in 1861, he was not promoting at all his Indian herb doctor business. He was claiming to be a surgeon. He was trying to convince the general to commission him as a staff surgeon. And what happened was 1888, we had this witness that this Charles Dunham, that claimed that he was a commander at the time, and Tumblety had invited the officers and medical officers of the generals one evening for an illustrated lecture, and he gave an illustrated lecture, and Dunham recalled that his favorite part of that illustrated lecture was his uterus collection of matrices of all classes of women. And that's quite damning because, of course, here's Jack the Ripper took the uterus out of two of his victims. Well, some people were trying to claim that Dunham was actually a spy, but he was a reptile journalist, as they called, where he was a great liar, and that he did it on purpose. He was doing it for the Union to set people up. So they claimed that we can't trust Charles Dunham, who was now a lawyer in 1888 in New York City, because he was good at lying. Well, what I found out is just before the Battle of Bull Run, Tumblety was in New York City at his office, and here is this herbal guy, and then in his office he has these pictures of all these anatomical specimens. And so then found out just before that, when he was in Buffalo, an eyewitness said that when he had his office, he would give medical lectures with thespian emphasis. So he was giving medical lectures prior to that. And then I just found out, don't tell anybody this. This is new. But when he was in St. John in 1860, when he was actually a man died under his care, this James Portmore. He was a carpenter. And so what happened was they charged Tumblety with manslaughter. But, Tumblety sneaked out of the country, and that's how he got to New York City and then eventually to the Civil War area. But what happened was there was a report that the jurors were horrified when they realized that Tumblety took the liver and the kidney from James Portner. So he was doing this. He was collecting these organs. And so at the time, even in Montreal, these medical communities, it was a huge thing for the students of med school, paid their way to steal bodies from the cemeteries so that they had it for their anatomy class. And it was a huge business. Even though there was a law against it, the real law that finally stopped it was 1883, but in the 1860s and 59, 60, it was just a big business. And so that was just a norm. And then in the wintertime, you could not bury bodies. So what would happen was, especially in Canada, you had these buildings that they would store the dead bodies until the ground would thaw. And so the students would steal the bodies from those. And Tumblety's office was right there at that time. And as a matter of fact, his young man, that is usually an office boy, claimed he was a student of Dr. Tumblety. And here's the students of the med schools. And then I found out when he had his office in Toronto, he called it the Medical Institute. And then the student that he used there was actually a doctor with an MD, claimed that he received his MD from Francis Tumblety around 1859 in Toronto. So he would have been a student there. So there's all these connections with with the medical diploma. It keeps on going.
I'll bet.
So that's the most recent research.
Sure. So as you've already stated, he's well known for his hatred of women, as evidenced partly by his collection of uteruses.
Yes.
Where do you think this misogyny originated?
Well, one of the things after I wrote the first book, we discovered 900. This is a court case in St. Louis, 900 pages of sworn testimony about Tumblety in the last 20 years of his life. And so that includes 1888 because he died in 1903. So we have these eyewitnesses. And the reason why that occurred is because in 1903, when Tumblety died, he had $3.4 million of today's value, and the family members all wanted it. And so he actually had a will that he bequeathed a third of that money, but 2/3 was still sitting there. So there was a big battle, a 5-year battle amongst the family members, who gets the money and all that. So there was a lot of these interviews. And in there, time and time again, these people talking about his bitter hatred of these women. Even one of his Baltimore attorneys said that just a year before he died, he's in the office of this attorney, and he's always Tumblety was always trying to sue people, but in this case, this woman came in for the attorney, but the attorney had to make a phone call, and at the time there was only one phone call in the building, and it was on a different floor. So he said, "I'll be right back." And when he came down, this woman was outside that room and shaking, and he asked, "What's the matter?" And she goes, "I will never be in that room again with that man there." So he was trying to get out of what happened, but she refused to say anything, and she just kind of ran away. And so whatever Tumblety did really freaked her out. And here's this guy 1 year from dying, so he's in his 70s already. And that's what I've also been finding is that Scotland Yard did not know about some of the things of his hatred in the United States, but they had a huge record on him. And that was the big surprise when in 1990s, when Stuart Evans, who was an expert of the research, he got this private letter, and this letter from this famous journalist at the time of the murders. So it was in the archives of this guy. And one was a private letter from the chief inspector of Special Branch at the time of the murders. And it was Chief Inspector Littlechild. And this reporter, George Sims, asked him who he thought Jack the Ripper was. So this was 1930. So this was like 15 years later. So it was hindsight stuff. And so George Sims thought it was Druitt. So he was saying Dr. D. And so then Chief Inspector Littlechild said, "Well, I don't know about a Dr. D, but I know about a Dr. T. Tumblety, and he was a very likely suspect." And then he talked about that amongst the suspects, he's the very likely suspect. And he said that Scotland Yard had this dossier, this large dossier on it, and talked about his bitter hatred of women. So in that file, there's evidence of him, which is now gone, but something happened in London that shows his bitter hatred. And recently, more of a collection of uterus specimens as well. That's going to be coming up soon.
Do you think that there was something in his early life that turned him away from women in general? Was there a cause for it?
I think a few things. One is that what we discovered was that he was a hermaphrodite, as in he was intersex condition. And there's different types of hermaphrodite. If he was a true hermaphrodite, as in basically he had male and female parts. And one of his other Baltimore attorneys remembered him passing out in his office and his pants falling down, and he noticed that. And so he had heard rumors from the police, this attorney in Baltimore, that Tumblety was a hermaphrodite. So he asked him straight up, and Tumblety said, "Well, that's a curse that's been with me all my life." And so then there's a couple other cases where some other independent people had talked about his condition, including the man that the undertaker who cleaned his body said that his penis was the size of the tip of your thumb, and it was really the strangest thing he ever saw. And what happened was they were devout Catholics, and at that time, there were a lot of misconceptions with Catholic doctrine as there is today, and one of them was that it was not Adam that committed the original sin; it was Eve deceiving Adam. Therefore, it's women. Women are inherently evil, bad. So it's original sin that caused disease in the world, or his condition. So he likely blamed women right at the beginning for that. But in the family, you could see that there was a division of sexes too, because when you look at the census material, the women were recorded as illiterate, but the three brothers, were literate. So the brothers went to school. And then there's a report now that we've just found that his brother Lawrence was reported to have the same hatred of women as his brother, as they said. And then there's a couple cases in Rochester showing that when he was a teenager, he avoided women as much as he could. Also, we have record of him with his young men. What he would like to do is he liked to recruit literate young men to write his letters for him and do things. And one person is Sir Henry Hall Caine, who was from Liverpool, and he's a famous poet, author. And when Hall Caine was 19 years old, he actually went to Tumblety because Tumblety had an office in Liverpool, and they eventually hooked up. And what happened was we have the letters from Tumblety in Hall Caine's archives, and in there he's just like as recorded other attorneys talking about that Tumblety would write letters to his young men saying, "Stay away from women. They're the curse of the land," he would say. And that's where you get this idea that they are the curse of the land and that they are decoys. And what Tumblety believed, and you can see from these letters, especially with Hall Caine's, is that he believed when young men were in their teenage years, that was the year that they could either go one way or another because they're so susceptible. And so he believed that it was at that time that women lured young men away from their intended lovers, him, basically. So,
Golly.
and then, yeah, and then so his habit always, so many people talked about, even this judge that knew him in New Orleans said his habit was each evening he would go in the slums. And, that's just like Whitechapel, the going in the slums. So he did that all of his life. In the evening, that was his habit, to go in the slums. He would go in the same place where these prostitutes were. So this hatred of especially prostitutes you could see because he would live that each evening.
So how did Tumblety find himself in England during the period when the Jack the Ripper murders happened?
Well, initially it started because what happened was when Tumblety was arrested for the Lincoln conspiracy, they confiscated his money in St. Louis, and he was raking in money. And so he claims it was $1 million in that year's value, but it likely wasn't that much, but it was quite a bit, I bet. And so he claimed that they didn't give it back. And so what he did was he went to the British consulate and said, "I'm a British subject. Could you help me get my money back from the U.S. government?" So that kept on going back and forth. So we have letters of that, correspondence. So in 1869 was the first time he went to London to try to push that. Well, he had a sister living in Liverpool, and he had a sister that lived in Bath, England, both places. And so he would visit family. And so that's why he opened up his office in 1875 in Liverpool, because his sister lived there. And we have this correspondence right into the 1870s. So the next time he went to England was about 1872. And then there's reports that he made it to England at least once a year. And one report has it twice a year, that he would go to England all the way to 1888, where that's when he was arrested on suspicion and he sneaked out of the country. But he was interviewed by a number of people, by a New York World Reporter, after the Ripper murders, and he was safely in the United States because they could not extradite him back. But he admitted to them that he was in the Whitechapel district during the murders. And he also admitted that to a young man in New Orleans. And then so that young man said that under oath, that Tumblety admitted that he was there. So when you look at means, motive, and opportunity, he was definitely there at the time. And we also know that because when he was initially arrested on suspicion, this was probably early November 1888 or October 1888. What happened is at the time, Scotland Yard, they were lost. The investigators were lost. And so what they did is they doubled the patrols, and the goal was they were going to arrest anybody, any male, lone male, that was talking to any of the unfortunates, and then take them into the station, local station, get their name and get where they live, and then cable Scotland Yard, see if they have a file on them. If there's a red flag, then they would deal with them more, or just let them go. Well, what happened is here's Francis Tumblety, who was, at the time, he had retired about 10 years before, and he retired and told everybody, and this is the big thing, was that he was a retired surgeon, and that his father was this famous surgeon in Dublin. So here it is, he's promoting that, and at the time, there was a suspicion that Jack the Ripper had anatomical knowledge. And also, in October, there were a couple letters, and there's a letter that's called the Dear Boss letter right now, that in September 27th, that came out, and that was just a couple days before the double event where 2 women were murdered. And it said, in the letter, it was read, and it's actually the first time that you see the name Jack the Ripper. That's where the name Jack the Ripper came from, was this Dear Boss letter. But it had what the British knew were Americanisms in there. There was like a dozen, meaning British people don't talk this way. Americans do, like Dear Boss, that phrase right there. And they initially didn't take that letter seriously until in the letter said that he was going to take the ear off one of these women, and the ear was severed. Part of the ear was severed in one of the women. So on September 30th. So they took that quite seriously. Well, so their idea is possibly Jack the Ripper is an American, has anatomical knowledge. Here comes Francis Tumblety coming in and claiming, hey, what, you're arresting me, and he shows his pockets that he's rich. He says, I'm a retired surgeon. What are you doing? So that right there would have been red flagged. And so then what happened is just like Chief Inspector Littlechild said, he had a huge file in Scotland Yard because ever since 1873, he was arrested for usually sodomy, but he was always dealing with the other side of the law in a lot of cases. And also Littlechild said there was something in there that talked about his bitter hatred of women, especially prostitutes. So red flag, red flag, red flag. And so that right there would have said, this guy we got to take seriously. Now, nobody saw the murders. So even if you arrest them, as I was earlier talking about the writ of habeas corpus, which was also in effect in England at the time, you arrest a person, you just can't hold them. Now, Scotland Yard was part of the executive branch with the prime minister is at the head, and then Home Office, the home minister, that person's in charge of the police force. And so what happens is they arrest, but then they have to put them in front of a police court magistrate, which would be part of the judicial branch within 24 hours, unless you charge them. Well, what happened was they had nothing on him on the murders, but because at the time he had letters from 4 young men from July to November that showed that he was basically doing some homosexual acts. So that was called gross indecency at the time. So they knew they had him on that. So you can see in the reports that the newspaper reports that they arrested him and they were just going to keep him off the streets to hold him in order so they can do a deeper investigation. And if the murder stopped, maybe he's it. So what happened is he was received into custody on November 7th. So then that means you're in front of the magistrate within 24 hours. And so that was a magistrate Hannay. We don't have any record of this. What happened is it was a closed session, which is rare, unusual to have a closed session, meaning there was always a British reporter at the police courts so they could record news. But the magistrate had the ability to have the reporter leave for a case that they didn't want in the papers. Well, for gross indecency, they certainly would have wanted that in the papers because here's this American that's abusing young British boys. Absolutely. So it wasn't Tumblety, even though if Tumblety didn't want it in the papers, it was Scotland Yard that didn't want it in the papers, which hinted that they had something more serious about that. So at first, what you do is you have it's called a remand hearing, where the magistrate hears it and says this case should likely go up to the judge, so we have to have a committal hearing to possibly commit it to the judge. So he usually set it up in a week later. So do we want to remand, put him in just prison till the committal hearing? Is he a threat to leaving, sneaking away? And so there was no case for that. So he likely would have posted bail. He had the money in his pocket. We know that Magistrate Hannay allowed bail on November 14th because November 16th he posted bail. We have that record of that in the Central Criminal Court calendars, November-December calendar, that he posted bail. So Hannay allowed bail on the committal hearing November 14th. And here's November 9th where the Kelly murder occurred. So people are trying to argue that Tumblety was in jail at the time, but what we just found out, there's another case that was an open session, so it was in the papers within a couple years of that, where Hannay, it was the same thing where this man molested 4 young men, so it's almost identical case. So they allowed open session, so he allowed bail for £400 at the remand hearing, and then when the committal hearing came, and he committed it to the judge like Tumblety's was committed to the judge, he allowed bail again, but that was for £1,000. But you could see that Hannay was allowing bail at both. And also, Tumblety would have easily gotten out by or Scotland Yard would not have taken him seriously if he was in jail when Mary Kelly was murdered. Yet, now we have lots of evidence to show that Scotland Yard took him seriously.
Interesting. There are many people who believe that the person who wrote the Dear Boss letter was not Jack the Ripper, though, right?
Right, most people don't. As a matter of fact, Chief Inspector Littlechild, in that Littlechild letter, which is now what it's now known to be, that made a comment about Francis Tumblety, he also talked about that the name Jack the Ripper likely came from these 2 reporters at the Central News Agency, which meant they wrote the letter, the Dear Boss letter. So Scotland Yard was not convinced afterwards of that. But they took it seriously at that time because what happened was after the double event, 2 women were murdered, Elizabeth Stride first and then Catherine Eddowes on September 30th. Just a couple days later, part 2 of the letter came in. We now call it the Saucy Jack letter, basically saying, see, I told you so. And so because of that, they took it seriously at that time. But soon after, they decided it wasn't as much.
Why was Scotland Yard so obsessed with the idea of the killer wearing an American slouch hat?
Well, it was dead end after dead end. And today, a lot of the suspects, you'll see, again, nobody saw the murders. So you don't really have a suspect for anybody killing. What you have are that some people saw possibly the unfortunate with somebody maybe a few minutes before. And at that time, people are taking that so seriously. Even Assistant Commissioner Anderson was convinced that one particular eyewitness likely saw Jack the Ripper. And so that's where he went into Kosminski. Well, therefore, it's Kosminski. And I think the average height would be like 5'7" or something to that effect. But eyewitness testimony is the weakest testimony we have. As a matter of fact, recently they did a big research called the Innocence Project, and they looked at 237 cases where the conviction was because of eyewitness testimony, and 73% were overturned because of DNA evidence. 73%, that's today. And so back then they didn't know eyewitness testimony was that poor. But even still, though, we humans are convinced of our eyewitness testimony. Let's say, for example, Elizabeth Long was an eyewitness in the Annie Chapman murder on 29 Hanbury Street. Saw her with somebody right there, possibly within that hour. The issue, though, is that she said that it was normal to have unfortunates or prostitutes hang there. It was a normal hangout. So it wasn't a surprise. It's not like, oh, could that be Jack the Ripper while she walks by? She's just doing her business. So then she has to recollect. And then when you're in court, just think even today, when, let's say, the defense attorney is just ripping you apart, you're going to hold to your guns and say, oh, I definitely saw that. It was absolutely that person, when you really should not have done that. And that's what that Innocent Project really shows, is that the eyewitness testimonies are very weak. So the American Slouch Hat, where that likely came from was, again, it was September 30th, October 1st when the Dear Boss letter came, and so then a possible American. So one of the things that people talked about a lot, you could quickly see an American because they would be wearing some style American hat. Was the slouch hat was a hat that had like a crease in the middle, wide brim, even really wide, and it was really Buffalo Bill style hats. But the British would wear like deerstalker caps where they're rounded tops, and so you can pick out an American. What happened is Sir George Arthur was a royal that was arrested on suspicion in early November, and he was wearing an American slouch hat at the time. And they kept it out of the papers, but they didn't keep it out of the New York World papers because E. Tracy Greaves, the New York World correspondent, he had a connection. He admitted that he had twice in October that he had a Scotland Yard informant. And in that article that he was writing, which was November 17th, this cable, the headline story was Sir George Arthur getting arrested, but the police were successful in keeping it out of the papers. Well, the second story was this American named Tumblety, this New Yorker named Tumblety with a K, was arrested on suspicion. And that was the very first time we see reported that Tumblety was arrested on suspicion. And so Tumblety admitted that he was wearing an American slouch hat. That was later. So what that means is that they were on the lookout. But it was at the time they were pretty much arresting everybody. But if you were an American and you're, let's say, giving a hard time to an unfortunate, you're likely going to be arrested pretty fast. And so that's kind of where we hear about the American slouch hat. And it wasn't just that, because even before Sir George Arthur was arrested, I have a report of a New York newspaper complaining that the British are thinking about it's an American and it's all about this American slouch hat. So there was a possibility. There was a case in October that this man that was very much like Tumblety. Was he Tumblety? We don't know because they didn't say his name. But at that spot, he was bragging to the other members of the lodging house about the Ripper murders, and he knew so much. And he was this American, and he was wearing this American slouch hat. So what happened was he got arrested. So was that when Tumblety was initially arrested? It may very well have been, or it might not have been. But what it does show is that there's this American slouch hat thing going on in October of 1888.
So if Tumblety had removed uteruses as Jack the Ripper, what were the chances that the police would have found them in his possession? They did arrest him after all. I'd assume that they would have maybe searched his property.
Well, so it was the uterus from 2 women, the kidney from 1, and then the heart from Mary Kelly. How coincidental that in January of 1888, and when Tumblety was in Toronto, he told this Toronto reporter that he was constantly in dread of sudden death because of kidney and heart disease. And here's a guy who has a history of this uterus collection. So those organs can only be connected to one suspect when you look at all the suspects. Nobody else knows why did Jack the Ripper steal those organs. And there is nothing except in case of Francis Tumblety, there would have been a reason, especially when we look at the offender signature. Dr. Brent Turvey looked at he's a forensic scientist, and he looked at the records of the victims. He did not see sadomosexual serial killer. He saw meaning sadistic behavior. He sees that the offender cut the throats deeply to stop the heart. So then when you eviscerate, you don't get blood splatter. So it wasn't you were sadistically enjoying the death of this woman and watching them die. And then there was reassurance-oriented, where that reassurance-oriented behavior is where you collect trophies. And so these organs would likely possibly be some trophies for some reasons, some connection. And for Tumblety, there would definitely be a connection. If he blamed these women, because we found out that Tumblety actually had neurosyphilis. And it was in the late 1888s where he realized it was out of control. By the mid-1890s, then he was walking the slums 100% as a homeless person, even though he was still a millionaire. So his mind really went by that time.
When we come back, more evidence that kept Francis Tumblety on Scotland Yard's radar. And we're back. When Tumblety was arrested, There were no body parts found among his possessions, right?
We don't know that for sure. What we do have a report, there were actually 5 correspondents, American correspondents for the papers. The 4 New York papers had London correspondents, and then Boston Globe had a London correspondent. In the Boston Globe, that London correspondent, who was in London at the time, said that they went into his room and they found things like the letters, something. But other reports said that the letters were actually on his person. But what we do know now, in the 1880s, Tumblety, he would still rent a room in a posh hotel in a wealthy area, but he would also rent a room in the slums. And I have record of this. He actually had 3 rooms at one time in 1881 in New Orleans, one in a posh hotel and 2 in the slums in 2 different spots at the same time. So he would have much of his stuff in one room. So when these British police officers were trying to determine their residence, of course he would let them know that he's living at this spot. He wouldn't tell him other spots. And so if he was actually keeping them, he would have likely kept them at a place that they would not have known. That's what would have likely happened if Tumblety. And also, lately, what I found out is that there was a report from the New York Sun, and their London correspondent wrote a report and said that one of the reasons why Tumblety was arrested is because of the Wayne Baxter theory that there is a person collecting uterus specimens, trying to buy uterus specimens. Well, nobody ever connected that with Francis Tumblety before. And what he's trying to say is Scotland Yard connected Tumblety with the uterus collection. They had no idea that Tumblety had a uterus collection in the Civil War because that didn't get there that far. So how did the New York Sun London correspondent connect Tumblety with this uterus collection? So then that leads to what happened is when Tumblety sneaked out of the country, Scotland Yard actually followed him back to New York, where there was a Scotland Yard detective right outside his window when he finally came. They could not extradite him back because the case at hand was a misdemeanor charge, and you can't extradite with a misdemeanor charge. But that detective was telling people that he was looking up at the window of Tumblety's at 79 East 10th Street, where Tumblety's room was, saying that he's going to catch the killer that did this. And then, wouldn't you know, that made the papers December 4th, and by December 5th, Tumblety sneaked out of 79 East 10th Street and vanished. And Scotland Yard didn't know, New York City never knew where he went. And we just found out, or I just found out just last year where he went. Thanks to newspapers getting digitally scanned, this small, low city town, Waterloo, New York, digitally scanned their newspapers, and they said that Tumblety's in town. Well, I knew that was true because Tumblety's sister lived there. And so what was curious about that is the reason why they even made a comment about that is because 2 women got accosted in the evening in Waterloo, and Tumblety was in town. So,
oh boy.
So, again, Scotland Yard never knew where he was.
How did he escape from England?
Well, one of the things that he was really good at, and being wealthy really helps out. And so a couple things happened. One is that the case at hand was the gross indecency and indecent assault with these 4 young men. So on November 14th, it was committed to the judge for a November 20th trial. When that happens, it has to go in front of a grand jury first. So November 18th was the grand jury, and they returned a true bill, meaning the jurors were convinced Tumblety did it. So at this time, when it went in front of the judge on November 20th, Tumblety wasn't there. It was only his attorney trying to ask to postpone the case till the December 10th, which the judge agreed to. Well, on that November 20th, wouldn't you know that we have record of Tumblety cabling money from his New York bank to him enough to get away. So that was November 20th. Chief Inspector Littlechild said that the first time they saw him outside of England was in Boulogne, France. And then the last time, then it was recorded by the New York, E. Tracy Greaves again, the New York World correspondent, that the last time they saw him was in Havre, France, on his way to America. Instead of going his usual exit Liverpool crossed to New York City, or sometimes Toronto. He actually sneaked the other way. So they were likely, if they were keeping an eye on him, they were likely thinking because his family members live in Liverpool, he's going to try to make it to Liverpool. Well, he went the other way and crossed the English Channel into France. So he had never done that before. Well, it's because he was sneaking out. And so, not because they were onto him about the Jack the Ripper murders, because he knew darn well that he was going to be in jail in Holloway prison for 2 to 10 years because of the gross indecency case. So then by November 24th, noon is when the La Bretagne left port to New York City. So he had to have been on that ship before noon on the 24th. So he had sneaked through it within those 3 days. Interestingly, that the warrant out for his arrest was December 10th because it wasn't in front of the judge until December 10th. And he was a no-show for December 10th. So they issued a warrant on December 10th. How come Scotland Yard knew exactly where he was or where he was going back in the early Novembers or the late Novembers? It's because they were interested in him. I mean, if it was just merely a case of a misdemeanor offense, why would Scotland Yard be so concerned about him, especially at a time when they were stretched out thin and they're focused on the Whitechapel murders? Well, we find out now that here's this Scotland Yard detective followed him to New York City.
So after arriving back in the States, did he become a suspect in any murders here that might have been similar to the Jack the Ripper ones?
Well, that's actually a good question. And it's kind of a corollary question to that is, were there any murders, Ripper-like murders in America that Francis Tumblety, if he was Jack the Ripper, would that be? One of the things, the first misconceptions, even if you look up on the FBI's website, one of the biggest misconceptions is that serial killers have to continue to kill. Sometimes they do, especially if they're sadomasochistic. If they have the sexual desire, sexual impulse to continue, you'll see that. But if it's, let's say, Dr. Brent Turvey talking about Jack the Ripper's motive would not have been sadomasochistic, a sexual thing, because the victims were really not penetrated sexually, but it was anger, retaliatory, hatred, a hatred of these women. And he talks about sometimes you see that somebody kills women that look like an ex-girlfriend or their mother, something to that effect. And that's this anger, retaliatory. So my first comment about if there's any connection in America would be, if Jack the Ripper was sadomasochistic, Tumblety was not Jack the Ripper, because his desire was young men, and there wouldn't have been anything sexuality. But if it was anger retaliatory, that would have been Tumblety to a T. And in a case of serial offenders that have anger retaliatory, they tend not to continue, especially if they almost get caught. But regardless, for some reason, we know that when you look at Tumblety going to London, he tended to come back from London in the late summer, early fall, when the Atlantic wasn't really nasty. But November, December, the Atlantic Ocean was getting nastier. So it's not the most entertaining time to cross the Atlantic. But for some reason, he wanted to stay in England at the time, longer than usual. And the only reason why he sneaked out of the country was because of that gross indecency case. So he wasn't done with whatever he was doing. Even if he wasn't Jack the Ripper, he wasn't done. He was likely staying there longer. So that if he did have an agenda to continue this, when you look at it, he was in New York. He considered New York City his residence, Brooklyn, New York City his residence. From 1888 to 1893, he continued. 1893 is when he changed residence to Baltimore. He was retired, and all of his travels were to watering holes like Hot Springs, Arkansas, health spas, and because of his rheumatism, as he called it, but it was really Hot Springs, Arkansas was actually the mecca for syphilis at the time. But in this case, we see that in New York City, there was actually 3 murders around there. New Jersey, New York City, there were 3 murders of women. One was very, very similar to Jack the Ripper murders, Carrie Brown. But I'm of the opinion that Tumblety, even though Tumblety lived within a half a mile of where Carrie Brown was murdered, I still don't think that he would have done it. But again, we do have these murders that are happening. But also what we find out is Tumblety was actually going to Mexico all this time, and we never knew this. And so he would always hit the Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and then he asked this young man if he wanted to come to Mexico with him. And that was one of his things. And so Mexico would easily have been a place if you were trying to collect organs or whatever you were doing. That definitely, he could have still continued any kind of deaths. He could probably get away with quite a bit in that country.
So if you had to pick one piece of evidence that you find the most compelling that tells you that Tumblety was Jack the Ripper, what would it be?
Well, what's interesting is what you kind of hinted right there is I'll never say 100%, because if you say 100%, case closed, then you're done with research. Now you're just trying to look to try to find evidence, and that's it. And that's not, should not be doing that. And that's so it's inappropriate. But what happens is with Tumblety, the big thing when my first book was to show that Scotland Yard definitely took him seriously, and they took him really seriously, enough to continue the investigation in America until the summer of 1889, when Mackenzie was murdered, and many in Scotland Yard considered that a Jack the Ripper murder, and Tumblety was in New York at the time, so therefore he's off the radar. But prior to that, he was still taken seriously. But then again, Scotland Yard might be wrong. So what is more convincing for me is that with the modern forensic experts looking at the offender's signature and the MO and the motive of what they see, matching Tumblety is convincing. But then a few other things, and it definitely is bitter hatred. But what we found out was in 1881, this was 7 years before the murders, and under sworn testimony, this young man named Richard Norris, who hooked up with Tumblety from 1881 to about 1901, 1902, and he had to admit that he was this young male prostitute at the time, or he would make extra money, as he said. But it was dangerous for him to say this in 1905 in front of the judge, because he actually was a prominent employee of the police department. He had a family and kids at the time, too. Yet he still had to admit what he was doing with this Tumblety in his early 1880s. But what happened was a few weeks after Tumblety finally got Richard Norris to help him out and write letters for him, he locked the door and he molested Norris. And so Norris got into detail. And Norris is another one, said he was a morphodite. So that's what he used, the term morphodite. So the attorney would say, "You mean hermaphrodite?" "Yeah, morphodite." But then, but what he said was he had a cigarette in his mouth, this young Norris. Tumblety ripped that cigarette out of his mouth and gave him a cigar, and he said, "There's two things wrong with young men these days: smoking cigarettes and streetwalkers. They should all be disemboweled." And Scotland Yard never knew he said this. This is such a Ripper-like thing. And then what I found out was, at that time, in the 1880s, in his travel chest, young Richard Norris said that he showed him his collection of surgical knives. And he said that it was in a tray. Well, remember Tumblety, during the Civil War, tried to convince the general that he was a surgeon. Well, surgeons owned their own surgical knives at the time. So if you're going to say that you're a surgeon, you better have your collection of surgical knives. And when you looked at even Google this, and you go on a look at the surgical kit, Civil War style surgical kit, you have the saws and other things at the bottom, but there's a tray with knives. And here's Richard Norris talking about this tray. And then the tray was actually in his travel chest. Well, that same travel chest is the chest that Tumblety would use to go to England at the time, in the 1880s. So here we connect surgical knives with Tumblety's travel chest and 1880s. He likely had those in 1888 with him in London. So the thing is that when I wrote my first book, we didn't even discover this stuff yet. And every time we discover something new, it's damning. Not only damning, how many other suspects are connected to, the surgical knives, and then had said such Ripper-like comments before the murders. So it's like, oh, that's kind of surprising. was then to find out that also 1903 was his last will and testament, but in 1901 he wrote a will and testament in Baltimore because he thought he was going to die. He was even in the 1880s he was constantly in dread of sudden death because of his condition. So he in there he actually had his them write that he was going to give a large sum of money to the Baltimore Home for the Fallen Women. And the question was, why is that written? And because that is who Tumblety hated most. That group of people were fallen women. Why would you bequeath that? Well, the one thing that was so true is Tumblety was a devout Catholic. He always went to church. And that's one of the theories, is that it was a kind of like a religious maniac that were killing these prostitutes. You could see clearly what Tumblety did is, if you understand the background back then, which is, again, a misconception of Catholic doctrine, but is to earn your way to heaven. But what happened is he seems to have been greasing the skids, because his next step was death. And then, he's not bringing anything with him, and he's going to be in front of the Almighty, is what he believed. So you better have atoned for your sins as best you can. So it fits that Tumblety would have done this. And it's so how coincidental. And then 1903, when he went to St. Louis into this Catholic hospital to die, that he was there for 3 weeks, and he went there, and in his pockets and in his personal possession was all of his jewelry that he always had, and a certificate or a letter from his New York bank showing how much money was. Again, he always had that in his pocket, so when he would be caught in the slums, that he could show that he was upper status. But what they found was 2 cheap imitation rings that were never reported in his pockets. And we have 3 or 4 other times where things in his pockets were reported because that made the paper, because he was arrested. Well, wouldn't you know it, Annie Chapman, she died in September 8th is when Annie Chapman died, right after Polly Nichols. And that's she was the first one that the uterus was taken. But also Jack the Ripper ripped off the wedding ring and keeper ring, a set ring, two brass rings that were ripped off. And at the time, and even today, people don't know why would Jack the Ripper have taken those. And the idea was maybe Jack the Ripper was trying to fake a robbery. Well, that wouldn't have. Who cares? He never did it to anybody else. So what's interesting about that is that actually is connected back to Francis Tumblety. Because if you looked at all the 5 women that were murdered, there were some more, but let's say the canonical 5, the 5 that were murdered, even the other ones, there was only one object on them that was connected to heterosexual bonding, heterosexual love. That's that wedding ring. And so that's what Tumblety hated most, heterosexuality. So it would have been Tumblety. If it was Tumblety, the reason why he would have been taking the kidney and the heart and the uterus is because he's blaming these women. And that's what his disease was. It's the same reason why he would have taken those rings. So again, when you look at any of the other suspects, they don't have an answer to why this person would take those rings, why this person would take those specific organs. Not, let's say, why didn't they take the liver? But they didn't. So this is so it's kind of intriguing. And then, and I'm still researching. I keep on finding more information, so that's the fun part about it. And then next year we should have a documentary coming out, so that'll be nice. So we'll see how that goes.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. So tell us about some of the other things that you're doing. I know you have a website, a bunch of other books. You host a podcast. You've been working on this documentary.
Yes. My primary passion is research. That's how my family history. That's how I got involved with this. When I found out that Tumblety was buried just an hour and a half away from me, then I wanted to go find this, and so I found it, and then did some YouTubing on that. But then, but it's just the discovery. Even my background is paleontology and fossil stratigraphy, and collecting these fossils, knowing that no one has ever seen these fossils, and discovering things that even the scientists have not yet. And that was just fun, the discovery thing. So even in my family history, there's discovery. But so it was discovering things that nobody knows about. And then to find out is everything I'm finding is that so damning to Tumblety, and the experts actually discounted him. And it was because of crafty arguments with limited information. And so back in from the 1990s to 2009, many of the experts really felt they have a bead on this thing, even though they may or may not know who the killer was. Well, now we have to put Tumblety into the equation. How does that fit? Well, I like the idea where he's not really considered anything. So what's happened is since I've written them, I've gotten into some, enjoyable debates. And then so even some of the people you've interviewed, we're friends actually, some of the people you've interviewed, but we've had some fun debates about this stuff. But it's enjoyable because it's all about, to me, it's all about discovering the truth. And DNA really is not going to work out. So there's a lot of fake news out there, but so that's why you got to always, get involved with the experts. And then again, that's what I do. And that's one of the fun things about interviewing with Al Warren, because we've interviewed some of the top experts, and I'm doing the interviewing because I'm the person that has the details about that. So I don't put my 2 cents in. I ignore my suspect, and I want to get as much from their perspective as possible. So it's fun. And then, but it has made some waves. I was in a documentary last year called Legend Hunter. Too bad that series on a Travel Channel didn't continue. But then there's another one coming up with Jason Figgis, who's the director, John West is the producer. So that's filming, and it's all on Francis Tumblety. So, and some of the recent discoveries that have come out. So it's exciting to see that happening. So it's just, again, COVID slowed things down for everybody. So it was a bummer because I was supposed to be flown to London to do the interviews, but they had the camera crew come here to Buffalo and do it, which is fine. But it's kind of fun flying to London on their dime. So.
Oh, and your website.
Oh, yes. Yes, michaellhawley.com. Make sure you put the L for my middle initial. Some MIT professor, Michael Hawley, stole michaellhawley.com, so I had to have michaellhawley.com. But it's my hub. I do social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff. But if you go to my website, I have, 20 articles, and they're all free. You can just download them there and read all the articles. And then my books are there available, how you can get access, and also podcast interviews too, kind of like this one. And then I videotape myself on some of the lectures that I've done. So some of the lectures, one of my lectures in Baltimore at the Jack the Ripper conference in 2016, I have a couple of the videos of that, and then some other specific details. Even when I did a lecture and people were asking about a couple years ago or last year about the possible DNA evidence on this shawl. So I went into detail about that. I talk about that stuff. So just continue to do that. And so I think that's kind of it's exciting. It's fun to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you. That was exciting.